Japan is the third largest national economy in the world today, which is especially impressive when you consider that it has been in a state of stagnation for 3.5 decades, not seeing sustained growth since the early 1990s. But the fate of the wider Japanese economy lies in stark contrast to its capital, Tokyo, the largest and most economically powerful city in the world. And this diversion is perhaps the most obvious example of a real economic problem that all advanced economies are quietly struggling with. Tokyo is home to more than 37 million people and has a GDP of over $2 trillion. If just this city was its own country, it would be the 8th largest in the world, ranking ahead of Italy and falling just behind Canada. This depends a lot on where you draw Tokyo's borders, because as the city has developed, it has massively outgrown its official prefecture and has slowly morphed with other nearby metropolitan centres like Chiba, Gunma, Kanagawa and Yokohama to form what most people now collectively call the Tokyo Major Metropolitan Area or the Kanto Major Metropolitan Area. No matter how it's defined for the sake of figures, the outcome is still clear. Japan is becoming a two-speed economy, with people in one city surging ahead of everybody else in rural areas and smaller regional centres. Japan and Tokyo may be the most obvious examples, but this is happening everywhere, and there's a good chance that it's only going to become worse in the next decade. The inequality between regional areas and certain select cities could become one of the strongest forces against sustained economic growth, just like it has been in Japan. Beyond just headline GDP figures, it can also cause a lot of social issues, where people feel they are forced into overcrowded, expensive cities where they'll live in tiny apartments just to stay in the part of the economy that is doing well. Of course, some people like the lifestyle of living in bustling metropolises, but this regional inequality is hurting them too. So, why is inequality between big cities and rural areas such a problem for the entire economy? Why is this even happening? There is more to it than you might think. And finally, what can be done to fix these problems? After we've done all of that, we can put Tokyo on the less and less relevantly named Economics Explained national leaderboard. Different regions having different levels of income is not a problem for the broader economy by itself. Certain areas are more expensive to live in than others and are home to industries that maximise productivity from workers. If people are getting paid more but spending more for the same quality of goods and services, then it sort of works itself out. In theory, at least. Economists will often adjust output figures using something called purchasing power parity to account for this discrepancy. For an extremely oversimplified example, assume that two economies both produce nothing but wheat, and they both produce 1 million tonnes of wheat every year and have the same population. The first economy sells its wheat for $400 a tonne, and each individual worker in this economy earns $10,000 a year. The second economy is more expensive. It sells its wheat for $600 a tonne and pays its workers $15,000 a year to compensate them for the higher prices that they'll pay for their theoretical economy's single output. Economy 1 would have a nominal GDP of $400 million, and Economy 2 would have a nominal GDP of $600 million. But which one is the bigger, wealthier, or more prosperous economy? They are both producing exactly the same amount of exactly the same good, and each worker can afford the same amount of that good for the money that they are paid every year. So, adjusted for purchasing power parity, these economies would both have the same GDP. Making this adjustment in the real world is a lot more difficult because, of course, economies produce more than one simple commodity, and they also use different currencies. Real purchasing power parity figures are made using consumer price index figures, with the USA as a baseline. If the average cost of goods and services in an economy is cheaper than in the USA, then its GDP will be adjusted up for purchasing power parity. China's nominal GDP, as reported by the World Bank in 2021, was $17.7 trillion. But because most goods and services in China are cheaper than in the USA, they get a lot more stuff for that $17.7 trillion. Their total output, adjusted for purchasing power parity, was $27.3 trillion in the same year. If the average cost of goods and services in an economy is higher than it is in the USA, then GDP purchasing power parity will be adjusted down. The USA is a remarkably wealthy and productive country, so not many economies have their GDPs adjusted down for purchasing power parity, apart from places like Switzerland and Luxembourg. Now, adjusting economic figures to measure the true output of an economy, not just how expensive things are in that economy, is an important thing to be able to do, because at the end of the day, economics is about providing things of value to the people. But it's not always as simple as this. Most GDP figures that economists will work with, especially if they're involved in international macroeconomics, will be unadjusted or nominal figures. Now, that's not because they're too lazy to make the purchasing power parity adjustments, it's because outright figures are more useful when economies interact with one another. Our wheat-based economies from earlier would start to run into some difficulties if they ever wanted to trade with one another, or if people wanted to move between these two regions. Nobody would want to buy wheat at $600 a tonne when they could get it from the economy selling it for $400 a tonne. And if someone wanted to move from the economy where they were earning $15,000 a year, they could buy a house 50% nicer in the economy where everybody earns an average of $10,000 a year. If these two countries are sovereign nations, then there are some barriers to that happening, like tariffs or taxes on imports and exports, and immigration control stopping people from moving between countries. But if these economies were just different regions of the same nation, then almost all of those barriers are removed. Large cities like Tokyo are home to jobs that on average pay more than jobs in rural areas and smaller centres, because when we're talking about inequality between major cities and everywhere else, we're not just talking about farms and the outback, we're also talking about smaller cities and towns that could still be home to 1 million people. Now, people earn more in these megacities, but it's also a more expensive place to live. However, that only means that residents can buy more of the goods and services in the country that are not region-specific. A car doesn't cost more just because it's purchased in the middle of the city, and other expenses apart from housing are less inflated than salaries. The problem this causes for the wider economy is that it becomes very hard to move into Tokyo or any of the other major cities around the world unless you already live there. It also disincentivises people to move out of cities because it can become really hard to move back in, which only heightens affordability problems. My own home city of Sydney is a really expensive place to live, and I could probably buy a much nicer house if I moved a few hours out to a smaller coastal town. I can do my job from anywhere with an internet connection, so there is no need for me to stay here, but I do. A big reason for my economically illogical decision is that if I ever wanted to move back to Sydney, I might not be able to afford it if house prices here increase faster than house prices everywhere else. Now, obviously I'll be fine, but I am taking up a house that could be given to someone that actually needs to live in a major city because that's where their job is. Big cities full of smart people, schools and companies are the primary drivers of innovation. Being able to share talent and ideas is much easier when people are closer together. If people can't afford to move into these areas or are not willing to make the lifestyle sacrifices necessary to live there, then the entire national or even global economy could suffer from the innovations that weren't made. The inequality between cities and rural areas will also accelerate another problem that most advanced economies are facing: their ageing populations. Cities are great places to promote the technical innovation that will drive the long-run growth of the global economy, but they're normally not ideal places to have children. Birth rates in major cities around the world are significantly lower than in rural areas of the same countries. A lot of people will move out of major cities when they want to start a family because buying a house big enough to raise children in these regions is just unbelievably expensive. People still do it, but it normally means living in cramped conditions, which is not ideal for the parents or the children. Moving just outside of the city into surrounding suburban regions where workers can commute back in to take part in the highly value-adding industries that major cities are home to is one option. But this causes what city planners call urban sprawl, where low-density housing grows in a wider and wider radius around a city centre, which demands exponentially more transport infrastructure and longer travel times. Eventually, family homes within a reasonable distance of a city become just as expensive as appropriately sized family homes in the city itself. This leaves a growing share of the population having to make a tough choice between leaving a city and the opportunities it offers to start a family, making big quality of life sacrifices to raise a family, or finally, choosing not to start a family at all. Just this year, in our videos on South Korea, France, Macau, Hong Kong, and the EU, we've had to speak about the importance of young workers entering the workforce to replace a growing number of older workers who are now retiring. Declining birth rates in advanced economies don't just happen because people get richer, they happen because richer economies tend to be those more focused around cities, and cities are difficult and expensive places to raise children. Beyond just the macroeconomics of this issue and the impact it will have on long-term growth, it has a very real human cost. Most people would choose to start a family if it was economically viable, but it's not in a lot of large cities, and because of the inequality between these cities and rural areas, it's not economically viable to live anywhere else for a lot of people either. So, if ageing populations are such an economic threat and slowing innovation could cost the global economy trillions, and both of these issues can be traced back to the problem of inequality between major cities and everywhere else, can the inequality be fixed? There are always going to be industries that pay more and places that are more desirable to live than others. No sensible policy is going to be able to change this reality without doing more damage to the economy than they fix. But these two do not need to be linked. Today more than ever, there is less need for a lot of workers to be physically located in the same city or even the same country as where they work. Creating policies that encourage people to work remotely and companies to offer it as an option will reduce the demand for housing around areas of concentrated industry. It will also reduce demand for transport infrastructure if less people need to physically move in and out of a city centre every day. One potentially negative short-term side effect of this will be that it will increase demand for housing in regional areas. In the short term, this will create social issues as workers moving from higher income cities will drive up the prices of everything in the places they move into. This can create the same kind of housing unaffordability issues that economists were trying to solve by getting people out of concentrated metropolises in the first place. Real estate prices trickle down into the price of a lot of other goods and services as well. If a restaurant needs to pay twice as much rent, they're going to pass that expense along to their customers. But on a macroeconomic level, in the long term, this could actually be a good thing. If the price level of goods and services is reduced in megacities and increased everywhere else, then it will reduce the gap between these two economic regions and increase social mobility for people who want to move back in or out. Another thing policymakers can do to reduce the impact of this economic trend is to build out high quality but high density housing around these megacities. Increasing the supply of housing will reduce its costs, and if these areas are managed well, they could become more suitable for families, alleviating the birth rate issue which comes with city-focused advanced economies. Unfortunately, these solutions are nothing new. Most economists dealing with these problems know that encouraging remote work and affordable housing developments will alleviate the problems caused by regional inequality, but enacting these policies is much easier said than done. People like the idea of affordable housing until it's their houses becoming affordable, and local residents will almost without fail push back against rezoning and high-density developments in the desirable areas close to cities. All the same, local governments welcoming in cashed-up residents from major cities are also going to have a lot of explaining to do to their voters when they feel like they are getting priced out of their own home. These are difficult steps to take, and nobody really wants to take them. But eventually we will need to, or else metropolises that have been the driving force of economic growth all over the world will slowly turn into dead weight holding that growth back. Okay, another one just for fun. Tokyo is the largest city in the world, and its local economy exceeds all but the largest nations in the world. So let's see where it sits on the Economics Explained national leaderboard. Starting as always with size. Estimates vary quite a bit about Tokyo's true output because it's much harder to measure things like imports and exports in a city where there are no formal controls about what is brought in and out like there is when goods enter a country. It also depends on where you draw the increasingly blurry borders of Tokyo City itself. But best estimates from reputable organisations place it between 1.5 and 2.2 trillion US dollars, which would make it one of the largest national economies in the world if it became a sovereign state. One city accounts for 2.2% of the world's total output. Tokyo gets an 8 out of 10. GDP per capita is also very impressive, since, as we've seen in this video, megacities like Tokyo are home to highly productive industries. Output per person is roughly $60,000 per year in this sprawling metropolis, which is 50% higher than the national average, even when including the less productive fringes of the city. That still places Tokyo behind the national average of the USA, but that is a remarkably high benchmark, so the city gets an 8 out of 10. Stability and confidence is quite high. When people think of business centres of Asia, they think of Singapore, Hong Kong, and Tokyo, and maybe less so Hong Kong these days. Tokyo might be a long way from its peak of crazy speculation in the 80s and 90s, but the new slow and steady approach has actually made it a more stable economy overall. It gets an 8 out of 10. Growth is really hard to measure because not many organisations track the output of cities, and even fewer do it over time when accounting for changing populations and borders. The best estimates that we could piece together from OECD and visual capitalist figures was a growth rate of around 3%, which is perfectly average for an advanced economy of this size, and especially impressive when taken in the context of the stagnated Japanese economy as a whole. Tokyo gets a 5 out of 10. Finally, industry. Tokyo is home to world-leading companies, a huge talent pool of labour, and combines all of this with a good reputation for producing high-quality goods and services and conducting business openly and honestly. Tokyo as a country would be impressive in this category. As a city, it's simply mind-blowing, and gets an 8 out of 10. Altogether, that gives Tokyo an average score of 7.4 out of 10, putting it just behind its home country on the leaderboard. Check out the video linked on screen next, or if you prefer to listen to these videos, we make all of them as well as full interviews with world-class economists available on our Spotify page. Thanks for watching, mate. Bye.